All right. So the next presentation is the recipient of the Oklahoma Online Excellence Award, Dr. Newman, and she is from Oklahoma State University. Dr. Newman, are you ready to get started?
I am. So I am Callie Ann Newman, and I am an assistant professor of educational technology at Oklahoma State. And I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about online course development, delivery, and practice. Oops. So to give you a little bit of my qualifications, I've been teaching online since 2011, and I just was kind of counting the years, and I was like, wow, that's 10 years ago already. I started teaching online as an online high school English teacher, and I did that, I guess 2011 to 2016. I've been doing online high school curriculum development and evaluation for about 8 years. I still dabble in that a little bit. I've been an instructor of online undergraduate courses, for 3 years, online master's level courses, doctoral level courses, a hybrid undergraduate course. But I think really the most important qualifications are the at the bottom here. I've actually taken online master's level and doctoral level courses. And I think it gives me a different perspective when it comes to teaching online, because I know what it feels like to be an online learner. So a lot of times when I'm talking to other faculty about what they want to do with their online courses, this always comes up: synchronous or asynchronous. There are positives and negatives to both. It's really a lot about your course and the type of, I guess, engagement and participation you want from learners, but also it has a lot to do with, I guess, the approaches that you typically like to use when you're teaching online. When you're considering synchronous delivery, I always tell people, you have to have this stuff posted in Canvas, in Banner, or when students are enrolling. And that's not always happening from what I'm hearing. So, it shouldn't be a surprise to students all of a sudden that they're going to be meeting synchronously online. And there always needs to be a plan for students who can't attend for whatever reason. Sometimes life happens, sometimes you can't be there, and luckily I think we're all very well versed now in how to record on Zoom and stuff like that. In terms of frequency, this is another thing that I talk with faculty a lot about, at least in my college. Do you really need a synchronous meeting every week? Is there room for you to do something maybe every other week, or once every 3 weeks? So really kind of taking a look at your schedule and trying to figure out, okay, well, are there times where maybe we don't have to meet synchronously? And when you do meet synchronously, make sure that they're worthwhile and interactive. Have interaction with your learners. So maybe you're doing polls or breakout rooms, or using some other external tools for students to be collaborating while they're in their breakout rooms. And then always, practicing ahead of time, making sure you know how to do certain things. Otherwise, when you're doing it on the fly, sometimes things don't go as planned, and that may happen even if you practice, but having those procedures in place and knowing what to do ahead of time will really reduce not only stress for yourself, but also make your class session run smoothly. In terms of asynchronous delivery considerations, which are also really important even if you have a synchronous course, but making sure you have multiple modes of presentation within each of your weeks, within each of your modules. So students aren't always just reading something, right? Maybe you have some videos or visuals that they're looking at, making sure that things are accessible. So there's captions, there's transcripts, students can zoom in and zoom out, they can search PDF documents, right? One of my biggest I don't know, I think people know me for this in terms of my online teaching is organization and consistency. So making sure that students don't get lost in your content, right? So making sure that they're able to really navigate and they have no issues, because really navigating the course shouldn't be a problem, right? So there should be no issues trying to find, where the assignment is or what they're supposed to do. And then additionally, communication and feedback. I was a former middle school teacher, and so my students, I think that they love that because I am very communicative, and I maybe overdo it a little bit, but I send out the weekly checklist every Monday. That's the beginning of my week. And I check in with them. I send them reminders, and I want to make sure that they don't forget my course and they don't forget, the things that they're doing in my course. So in terms of initially developing an online course, I always kind of start at the top level and consider my main objectives for the course, and then break it into my different units based on the content. And I'm always considering what information needs to be covered. Are there any helpful examples? How are students going to practice what they've learned? How am I going to provide feedback? How am I going to assess them? And then what instructional media do I need? What instructional strategies am I going to use? And I always like to use this kind of visual when I'm talking to people about designing and developing their courses, because I think it kind of simplifies things. You're not going to get everything in a table like this, but it helps you kind of chunk all of the information in a way that is organized, and allows you to really see, the alignment of not only each of your enabling objectives, but how everything comes together to achieve your overall course goal. I use this previous table as I'm mapping out my course, but another thing I think that is really helpful for students is to kind of chunk everything by week. Students are thinking in terms of the weeks. So I transition the content kind of from that first table into a more of a weekly schedule. So I may have, certain weeks where we're covering the same unit in those weeks, but I still would break them out into, for instance, maybe week 2 is design and week 3 is design, like on this examples schedule here. So another thing that I always recommend to instructors who are designing and developing online courses for the first time, overpack the schedule. Don't add readings or assignments after the start of the semester if you can at all help it. Sometimes there are, current events or, timely things that come out that you really want your students to engage with, and I think that's fine. But I'm a huge proponent of, take things away, don't add things in later. And students love that. So if you kind of overpack it, I guess at the beginning, you can always take things away and they will praise you because, you took one thing off their plate for that week. But, definitely always try to stick to the schedule as much as you can, and don't move due dates up, but push them back. So kind of just, I guess, some of my simple recommendations that really students seem to love and they seem to appreciate. 2 other main recommendations before I go into course organization a little bit more, but create modules for, the major or important course documents. So like your syllabus, your schedule, and then also create modules kind of for the for each week of the course. Again, students really do think by week almost, and so that's usually pretty helpful for them. I also recommend creating kind of sub modules within each week and making them consistent throughout. So I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. Here's kind of an example of one of my Canvas courses. We use Canvas at OSU, and I really do try to keep the number of navigational things as simple as possible. So I always set the course homepage to be my modules here. And so students really don't have to go anywhere. And so I have my important course documents, then I have my weekly modules, and I'll have the content of that module as well as the dates to kind of reinforce what each week is. And then when you expand one of the modules, I have these kind of submodules, or they're called text headers in Canvas. So I always have start here, readings, and activities. And so I always, have those in every single module. So here you can see it, kind of 3 of my different weeks. These 3 things that students are always looking for makes things really consistent for them, and they they just know what to expect. There's no surprises when they open a new module because of the repetition of it. Additionally, and I just started doing this about a year ago, but you can use emojis in Canvas, which is really fantastic. And these students have said multiple times in different courses, they love them because they know where to look. It's not so text heavy. It breaks it up. It cues their eye, and they know where to go for different things. So consistency really is the key there. And keeping in line with consistency, in every module in the Start Here section, I always have the first thing in there is the weekly checklist. So students know that they need to look for that, and that gives them kind of all of the things that they need to do that week. I always have my weekly video. There are weeks where maybe I don't have one, but I'll say, hey, see the week 5 video if we're in week 6. And then I always have the transcript. And really, rather than a transcript, I would say it's more of a script for me for when I'm making those videos that I can put in there for those who would kind of want to refer to reading it. I also have, multiple modes of presentation represented in every week of my course. So here's kind of an example of one of my weekly checklists. So, I have the steps, and I always recommend that students work through each week's activities, or I guess all of the things in the checklist in the order that's presented in the checklist. So, students are going to watch the video, they're going to read, whatever. But I also have the access location here. And again, this is another thing that can maybe get repetitive, but there's no questions. I know students shouldn't have any questions about how they navigate my course because it's all very clear to them throughout. Additionally, accessibility, as I mentioned earlier, is super important. And so we have a studio at Oklahoma State through Canvas. But, if you're uploading videos to YouTube, you can, make sure that you have the closed captioning on there. Another thing that I always like to point out to students is that they can speed up or slow down the videos, whether it's in YouTube or it's, the one from Studio and Canvas. And that's, I think, really helpful for some of them. I'm someone who I watch most videos that I watch at like 1.5 speed. I need it to be a little bit faster. Sometimes I talk fast, and so I know students are able to then slow it down if they need to just be able to hear me a little bit more. So having those accessibility features really is important for any student in your class. And I already went through that part. But again, I have the transcripts there too, so students can always kind of be reading along with that when they're watching the video, if they want it as well. In terms of assignments and assessments, clearly written instructions are obviously super important. One of the things that I've really started to do in all of my courses, whether it's synchronous, asynchronous, or even a hybrid face-to-face course, all of my instructions have this what to do and what to submit. And I usually put some sort of line to break it up in Canvas. And this is really helpful for students too, because it kind of breaks it out and chunks it, and they know, okay, these are all the things that I need to do for this assignment. And then this is what is expected of me in terms of submission. You might have examples that you put in there. I have several, courses and assignments where I'll maybe put an example for students to reference. I have a very clear due date. And then I also always make sure I tell students how I want them to submit it. So for this assignment in particular, I want you to submit it as a Word document, and please name it with these conventions. So I think, students appreciate just clarity, and I think on the instructor side, when you can be as clear as you want, or when you can be very clear, I think you're going to get submissions that are more in line with your expectations. I know that's probably a no-duh kind of comment, but I think we've all, had to revise instructions because when students, end up turning something in, you're like, oh, that is not what I intended for you to do. So the clearer you can be with your expectations, the hopefully the better submissions that you'll get. In terms of discussion boards, these can be kind of controversial with students. A lot of students have said to me, yeah, I didn't appreciate the discussion boards. I felt that they were inauthentic, or, this or that. And I remember the first time I really used them, I had to reflect a lot on really, the purpose and what I wanted them to do. I think it's definitely fine to have required responses, but the more constraints you put on those required responses, and even the initial post, the less authentic it becomes. So I often, require students to actively engage, I typically don't put, word counts on them, mostly because that generates inauthentic responses, right? So I try to definitely, with discussion responses, be a little bit more along the vein of, I just want you to actively engage with each other. I usually will give them some sort of prompt to keep them focused, I guess, on what they're responding to. But I also always have, my due dates and very clear instructions. I really like using this MANIC framework when I'm doing a lot of my master's and doctoral level courses. I think it really gets at the heart of students understanding what they're reading potentially for that week. I always also have a kind of general discussion board for any questions that students might have, or if they want to share any resources maybe that they found that are relevant to the course. Again, with consistency, I am very clear in my syllabus about kind of the schedule. My weeks start on a Monday and they end on a Sunday. You have assignments typically due on Wednesdays and Sundays, and if you remember Wednesday and Sunday, you're going to be good to go. Sometimes there might not be an assignment on Wednesday, but if you still remember Wednesday and Sunday, you're probably not going to miss anything, right? And I always try to be very clear about that in the syllabus, in the weekly videos, and in the course introduction video, that these are going to be your consistent dates and things that you need to remember. So again, I think a lot of people know this by now because of the year that we've had, but there's a lot of planning that goes into designing and developing a good online course. And you really need to make sure to think through the course in its entirety when you're planning. Being organized and consistent is so important for so many reasons, but if you want to avoid learners getting lost, the organization and consistency really won't be a barrier to student learning. Using multiple modes of presentation is really important, so you're not just constantly assigning readings and papers. Having different things that students are doing, and then really writing clear instructions. I'm going to quickly talk about community of inquiry framework. When you're in an online course, sometimes it can feel as though, oh, I'm hearing feedback. Sorry. So sometimes it can feel as though no one is kind of on the other end, right? So teaching presence is really important, social presence is really important, and cognitive presence is really important. I'm going to mostly talk about teaching and social presence, but teaching presence being, the involvement of the teacher in designing the course and interacting with students, and social presence. So, students' perceptions that they're actually interacting with real people online and not robots behind the screen. Oops. So in terms of teaching presence, you have kind of your instructional management, so the whole design of the course, building understanding, so interacting with students around the course content and facilitating their productive interactions with each other. And then some of that direct instruction, so creating or curating resources to present content, give feedback, and classifying teaching activities at this level are not totally necessary or helpful, but just understanding that they're all really a part of developing that teaching presence is important. So ideas for achieving teaching presence, providing personalized, individualized feedback. I cannot tell you how many times I've even been in just a face-to-face course that I'm teaching, and I have two students sitting next to each other, and they say, one of them says, "Ooh, so-and-so gave us our grades," and they both pull up their grades. "What does yours say?" Read it. "Oh, mine says the same thing," right? So students really, they want to know that you're providing them personalized feedback. One of the things, and I'm super guilty of this, so a huge recommendation is reply to some student discussion posts, not all of them, and summarize patterns and trends. I'm really guilty as a former middle school teacher. I want my students to all connect with me, and I'm terrible. I reply to all of them in the discussion board. That's not recommended. It's not, it's just something that I feel like I can't let go of. I want them to all hear me and feel like they're being heard as well. Also letting students see and hear you. So when you're creating instructional videos, make sure your face is in the screen. I've had a lot of students say to me, even though this was an asynchronous course, I felt like I knew you because I saw you every week. So that's really important. Responding to questions as promptly as you can. I'm kind of annoyingly on my email, so I respond to students really quickly. But trying to make sure that you do connect with them and respond to them promptly is important. Having weekly email communication. Again, I said I send out the weekly checklist at the beginning of the week, and I also send out reminders. Having that question space on a discussion board, using a variety of presentation tools, and really, again, going back to that course organization, making sure you're not, there are no barriers to students engaging with your content. And then finally, kind of ideas for achieving social presence. So again, let students see faces and or hear voices, not only yours, but each other. Letting students get acquainted socially at the beginning of the semester. One of the things I love doing is using Flipgrid at the beginning of the semester, and students do 2 truths and a lie. And so then in the second week of the course, after everyone has tried to guess what their lie is, they reveal what their lie is in the discussion board. So it's kind of a fun way for students to make connections with each other. And then, letting students share personal experiences related to the course content, and then using low stakes collaborative projects. So if you have a group feature in your LMS, or maybe shared Google Docs or Google Slides, really letting them get to interact with each other.
Dr. Newman, thank you very much for that awesome information. It's very easy for me to see the experience that your students have going through your courses. And my question for you is really, it's back to what you put on, I think, one of your first couple of slides there about being an online student in a master's program and doctoral program. I'm just curious to know, are there any particular aha moments that you had whenever you moved from that student position over to the designing and teaching role that you have now, that really kind of just made you go, why was I doing this? Why am I causing myself some grief, unnecessarily here for my students? Because I've felt that so many times personally in my own courses. Like, why do we do this?
I think I was lucky. So I had some really great online teachers when I was in my master's program, as well as in my doctoral program. But I also had some bad experiences. Right. And I think kind of learning from some of those helped me avoid a lot of the things that, I never wanted my students to experience. And, I think especially because we changed from D2L to Canvas over the last, I think maybe 2 years ago now. So there have been some speed bumps just kind of navigating in a different space. But, I for instance, like the emoji thing, when I realized that I could put emojis in text headers, I was like, oh my gosh, why haven't I been doing this before? And so I don't know that they were necessarily barriers for students before. Things were still organized, but just the little things like an emoji, putting an emoji in a text header, just cueing their eyes. It's like, oh, this is so much better than it was. So, I think again, that experience of being in a lot of online classes previously helped me so much in terms of things that I really liked from some of my professors. And then some of the things that I was like, oh my gosh, like I don't ever want my students to have to hunt for anything in my course. Like it should be there and ready for them.
I just want to say,
Yes, I can.
I really enjoyed your presentation, and your pedagogies and styles very similar to mine. Just haven't had a chance to actually teach a class online since I've been in Oklahoma, but I've been helping to design them. And when you said you felt guilty about that you had replied to every student, and I think that's something that I always want to recommend, but I'm always afraid to. So just try to say, like we were saying, to try to see trends. And then what Flower Darby recommends in small teaching online is to, because, some faculty don't have time to reply to every student, but to say, have like a shout out for someone who was really spot on what they were writing in the discussion, and then write in a summary. So what I used to do is I would always start the discussions off with, like something important. Then in the middle of the week, I would have kind of like a, sort of like checking in with everyone. How's it going? Are you following along? And then at the end of the week, just saying, okay, now we're wrapping up the discussion. And these are the students that really stand out with, who have like, something really important.
Yeah, you just reminded me that is something that I do. I do weekly shout outs for students. And so I'll make like a little quick image on Canva and then send that out to students as well. Like, just to give them some recognition. And I think that's another thing that they definitely appreciate, because they know someone's looking at their work.
Oh, that's cool. On Canva, so you copy the quotes and put it in like a banner?
Actually, so Canva, it's kind of like an external tool where you can make images and flyers and stuff like that. So yeah, so I'll make those and then grab the image and send that out to students.
Oh, that's a neat idea. I like that.
And it's something that I think a lot of them appreciate as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank
Dr.
you.
Newman, I have a question for you, and this may be a bit of a brainstorm perhaps. I completely agree with what you're saying regarding providing the individualized feedback to your students. And I think, what I feel from them is that that's where the value of their education is often communicated, through that individual relationship that's built there. Do you have any recommendations for faculty that might be teaching larger courses where that may not necessarily be as practical to be able to, provide and granular at that level, to each student, unless you obviously have some teaching assistants in there that can help with that?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I mean, I'll admit I'm very lucky in that I typically have classes that are capped around 20. So I have, the ability to do that with my students. In those larger classes, I think probably what I would do if I didn't have teaching assistants is try to really kind of break up the students, chunk them, and do my best to give individualized feedbacks, probably in different chunks. Or for instance, on a specific assignment, if you're really looking for something in particular, really making sure you identify that in students' work, whether it's there or not, and then, having, focusing your feedback around whatever that is.
Okay.